evening. I'm Dr. Grace Torra, with the Dean of the Iona School here in the Diocese of Olympia. And joining me this evening is Dr. Bill Hardwick. He also teaches at the Iona School and is a priest associate for adult learning at St. Mary's Church in Lakewood, where his wife, Marion Stinson, is priest in charge. And I love this part. Bill and Marion came to Washington 4 years ago with the intention of retiring, but they discovered that God has other plans for them. And I got to say, that's kind of my experience of retirement as well. So, welcome to the party. So, welcome, Father Bill. It's so nice to have you here. And I am looking forward to hearing about mysticism with you.
Thank you, Grace. Reminded me of an old saying: the easiest way to make God laugh is to tell God your 5-year plan.
Indeed.
I'm very excited to be here tonight. I'm looking forward to being able to share with you some thoughts about mysticism. Let me start by saying that this is a very big topic, and all we're going to be able to do tonight is just kind of introduce it to you. So I want to give some preliminary answers, remind you, preliminary answers to 4 questions. So what is mysticism? Who are the mystics? And why does mysticism matter? And how could we become mystics? So to start with, we're going to talk about what is mysticism. So Grace is going to share my notes on the screen. Okay, good. So there are, perhaps a better word to use than definitions might be descriptions of mysticism. And there are many of them. And I just chose 2. The first one is from Carl McColman, who is a writer and teacher of spirituality and mysticism. He's the author of a very handy book called The Big Book of Christian Mysticism. And he defines or describes mysticism as the heart of spirituality, where all religious differences are resolved, the experiential core of spirituality. It reminded me of one of the writings of Meister Eckhart, a medieval mystic, who said that theologians may disagree, but mystics all speak the same language. So that's one part of mysticism. The other part is that it's the experiential core of spirituality. Experiential is the key word there. The other quote is from Jean Houston, who is one of the founders of the human potential movement. And hers is a little bit broader. Mysticism is a particularly focused part of spirituality. The mystic is a person who aims at and believes in the attainment of such union with God. In its classical spiritual form, it is a heroic journey, and valiant efforts are required to follow the path. Thanks, Grace. So several things I think we can take away from those descriptions and just from some of my own experiences. First of all, mysticism is a spiritual path. It is a way of living out our faith. It's a difficult path, but a rewarding one. And the thing about it is that it's a cooperative effort between the mystic and God. You know, mysticism is not like having a road map, getting in a car and driving towards a destination. Because in mysticism, first of all, there is no map. We don't know what the destination is, except in general terms. And God is the one who's doing the driving. So mysticism is always a cooperative effort between the mystic and God. Secondly, the goal of mysticism is to attain union with God. Now, what does that mean? What does it look like? Well, it's going to be different for every mystic. That's why I say we don't know the destination. we don't know it exactly. We couldn't plot it on a map. It is entirely in God's hands. And we have to simply trust that God is leading us, not only in the right direction, but towards the right end. But the whole idea of this union with God is that we become close to God, not only close to God, but in fact, one with God. Now, that may seem strange, may even seem to be heretical. In fact, many of the mystics were tried as heretics. Meister Eckhart, who I just mentioned, was tried as a heretic, but luckily or unluckily, he died before the verdict was pronounced. So this is probably going to happen to me more than once. I've lost my train of thought. I am getting older. So this whole idea of obtaining union with God means that we, in Paul's words, become one with God, so that it is God who lives in us and speaks through us. Third thing about mysticism is that it involves a change of consciousness. This might be the most important part. So what does that mean? Well, it means that mystics attain a different way of seeing reality. You know, as human beings, we only see part of reality. We see the physical part, God's creation. What we don't see is that the spiritual realm is embedded in the physical. When the Word became flesh, all of the spiritual realm became one with the world. Actually, it always was that way. But we became aware of it through the experience of God becoming human. And what happens in mysticism is that the mystic gets a glimpse of two things. Gets a direct glimpse into the spiritual realm, learns things about God, doesn't just learn things about God, experiences God in a new way. And then secondly, begins to see how the spiritual is reflected in the physical. How every once in a while you get to see where the two are joined together. The thing is that in the world that we live in a binary world, a world where everything is duality. Things are either good or bad. Things are black or white, hot or cold, sweet or savory. And while there is a middle ground, we're constantly faced with this having to make a choice between two different poles. In the spiritual realm, everything is united and in harmony. And more than anything else, I think, this is what the mystics get to experience. Again, it's hard to describe exactly what it is that what happens, but they get to experience that unity of all of reality, both the spiritual realm and the physical realm. Okay, so what does a mystical experience look like? Well, it's a direct experience of God or of the spiritual realm. In scriptural exegesis, we call them Theophanies or hierophanies, whether it's an appearance of God in some form or just a general kind of experience of a spiritual realm. And different mystics experience them in different ways. So I just want to give a few quick examples. Francis of Assisi, who I think everybody knows about, in general at least. He was the son of a wealthy manufacturer of cloth, and he had a rather problematic youth. He was in the army for a while, got taken prisoner, and then he kind of got out and lived a rather dissolute life. But he finally came to a point where he said, this is not where I want to be. And so he confronted his father in the town square in Assisi, Italy, and he took off all his clothes. Ironic, he's the son of a cloth maker, and walks away. And then he wanders around for a while, not knowing what's next, what's the alternative to this life. And he wandered into a church, the Church of San Damiano in Assisi, and he started praying. And he looked up at the crucifix, and he heard God speaking to him from the crucifix. And he heard God saying, "Francis, repair my church." Now, this little church was actually falling apart. And Francis meant that God wanted him to fix up the church. So he actually did it. But then he began to hear God's voice again, directing him to a larger mission of repairing the whole church and not just the buildings. Teresa of Avila, who is I gotta see if I can find in my notes here when she lived. It's sometimes hard to keep track of. She lived in the 16th century. And she was a nun, has a very interesting background, and, given more time, I'd talk more about her because she had a very interesting life. But at any rate, it took her a while before she was, I think, in her 40s, when she had her mystical experiences. And she was convinced that Jesus Christ presented himself to her in bodily form, though invisible. Kind of an interesting mystical experience, that she knew he was there bodily, but couldn't see him. Now, the last one is a modern mystic, and you may laugh a little to see the name. Some of you know my wife, Marion, but she is a mystic. There's no doubt about it. I knew it from the first time that I fell in love with her. And she grew up in a non-religious house. And she probably never heard the words God or faith or religion. But when she was 4 years old, she had a next door neighbor who was 6 years old, who had just started parochial school. And one day this neighbor said to her, "Marion, have you been baptized?" And Marion said, "What's that?" So she explained it. She said, when Marion went back to her mother and said, "Mom, have I been baptized?" And her mother said, "No, we don't do such silly things." So Marion saw her friend again the next day, and her friend said, "Well?" And she said, "No, I'm not baptized." And her friend got very sad and said, "I guess I won't see you in heaven." Marion said, "Well, is there any alternative to this?" And she said, "Well, maybe. Maybe if you stayed up all night and kept repeating, 'Jesus, I love you. Jesus, I love you. Please let me into heaven.'" So that night, Marion went to bed and propped herself up on her pillows and started praying, "Jesus, I love you. Jesus, I love you. Please let me into heaven." And within 5 minutes, she fell asleep. But in the middle of the night, she woke up and felt a presence in the room. It wasn't a person. She knew there was no other person in the room, but she felt a real presence. But what she felt most of all was this overwhelming sense of being unconditionally and passionately loved. Now, I tell this story many times. Marion has given me permission to tell it. But there's 3 different ways of experiencing the presence of God in a mystical experience. And they don't exhaust the list by any means. I mean, you go through all of the various mystics, the classic mystics, the mystics who have written about their experiences, and there's just as many different ways of experiencing it as there are mystics. So let's hear from some of the mystics themselves and see a little bit about what it is that the mystics learned about God and the spiritual realm. So Grace, next page. Oh, sorry, I forgot there was one topic I have out of order in my notes. So what I want to talk about next is, why are mystics relevant, even important to the life of the church? So mystics give us an insider's view of the church, so to speak. You know, this whole idea that reality is much bigger than we know, and that the real anchor, the real base of reality is unseen. They get a look at that. They get an insider's look at that. They get a look at at reality that hopefully we all get in the next life. But they get it while they're still living. So they can tell us about what that looks like. And also, mystics demonstrate what full Christian living looks like. You know, mystics, the classic mystics at least, are not just people who have had some experience or experiences of God in the spiritual realm, but they base their lives on it in a radical way. And so we would call them radical Christians, because what they did were things that most of us might like to do, but aren't able to do. The reason they're able to do it is because they're mystics. And finally, mystics are able to clarify and suggest alternate understandings of traditional teachings. You know, there's lots of things that have been taught in Christianity that are not doctrines. Our doctrines, certainly as Episcopalians, our doctrines are found in the creed, basically. But there are lots of other things that are involved in living a Christian life that over the years, many theologians have speculated about what this means and what that means, particularly passages from Scripture, and we're not always sure. What mystics do are able to give us a different reading of traditional church teachings. Now, some of them do actually give unorthodox readings of church tradition, and some of them got into trouble. As I mentioned, Meister Eckhart was actually put on trial for heresy. But they all have an understanding based on their experiences of God, and are able to help us to get a grip on some of the teachings that we have that maybe some of us are not so sure about. All right, so now we can move on to take a look at the words of the mystics themselves. And there's so many mystics, and there's so many incredible things that they have written. And so I had to really make some choices because we only have an hour. So I only chose two mystics, one from the Middle Ages and one from modern time. And the one I chose from the Middle Ages is Hildegard of Bethany. Hildegard was a Benedictine nun who, as you see, lived mostly in the 12th century. And she had her first mystical experience at the age of 3, but didn't quite understand it until she became all of 5. But she continued to have mystical experiences and didn't really want to share them, but she did share them with her confessor. And finally, her confessor said, you know, you ought to write these down. These are valuable insights that you have. And finally, at the age of 42, God appeared to her in a vision and said, Hildegard, I want you to write down your visions. And so she did. And she wrote 3 books about her visions. In the book, not only does she talk about the visions, but she does what any good theologian would do. because Hildegard was a theologian of the first class. So she expounds on her visions and talks about what they mean for us. I have 3 quotes from her. The first one is, God's word is in all of creation, visible and invisible. The word is living, being, spirit, all verdant greening, all creativity. This word manifests itself in every creation. Now, this is how the spirit is in the flesh. The word is indivisible from God. It's actually a commentary on the first part of John's Gospel, in which the author of the Gospel says, in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God, and the Word became flesh. So this is one of the predominant theme. Actually, the theme is actually on top there. God is present in all creation. That many, in fact, most of the classic mystics came to experience. Not just to know that God is present in creation, but to experience it and to feel it for themselves. And one of the things about Hildegard is her use of language and her imagery. And we'll see in a minute how some of that imagery plays itself out. But she was a very good writer. She talks about this word, which in John's Gospel is kind of a mysterious symbol that John uses to describe the second person, what we call the second person of the Trinity, what John talks about as this part of God that always existed and was important in creation, that creation came through the Word. So what she's saying here basically is that not only did was the Word involved in creation, but still is. The Word is living, being, spirit, all verdant greening. This is where her use of language comes in, all creativity. Because she, as most of the mystics do, understand that God's work in the world is ongoing. It didn't stop with the creation of Adam and Eve. That God continues to create, and that God is present in the creation through God's word. Okay, next slide. So this one is about how God and creation are joined by love. And again, what I really like about this quote is her use of language. Creation is allowed in intimate love to speak to the Creator as if to a lover. I compare the great love of Creator and creation to the same love and fidelity with which God binds woman and man together. This is so that together they might be creatively fruitful. So, God and creation are still creating. And it is a creation that is born out of love. Love is the one theme that all mystics have in common. If whatever they experience of God, they experience God's love. And they see this love inculcated in the world in numerous different ways. So this is, again, another theme that the mystics have, and this is Hildegard's take on that. Okay, next. Now, this one is a very challenging passage, but it's one that's very apt for our time. Humans are called to care for God's creation. And Hildegard wrote, this has come from her second book, I hear a mighty voice crying from the elements of the world. We cannot move and complete our accustomed rounds as we should do according to the precepts of our Creator. For humankind, because of its corruptions, spins us about like the sails of a windmill. And so now we sink from pestilence and from hunger after justice. She cries out that the earth should not be injured. The earth must not be destroyed. All of creation gives to humankind, all of creation God gives to humankind to use. But if this privilege is misused, God's justice permits creation to punish humanity. I think this has a lot to say about global warming, for example. I mean, I certainly don't buy into the theory that God sent global warming to punish people for their sins. But what I do believe is that God created a system in which human beings are part of the whole creation. And if we start misusing the rest of creation, that creation is going to rise up against us. And that's what seems to be happening. Now, there's a controversial theory that the current pandemic is also a result of that human beings have gotten too close to nature, that we spend too much time handling animals and allowing animals into the human world. I'm not sure if that's true or not. But again, it fits into this theory that, creation has a will of its own, and that that creation is able to interact with human beings in a way that sometimes humans don't like. Okay, next slide. So the next person that I want to talk about is Pierre Desjardins. Now, Desjardins was a Frenchman. Obviously, by his name, you could tell that. And he was from a noble family, but from a very early age, dedicated himself to a life of service. He was born in 1881, and during World War I, he was a stretcher bearer in the war. And he saw the horrors of war and determined that he needed to help people create a world in which war was not necessary. So he became a Jesuit priest. But then he also went on to study and became an anthropologist, an archaeologist, theologian, and a philosopher. His writings are groundbreaking. His understanding of Christianity is something that is like no one else's. He wrote a number of books, and all of them were condemned by the Vatican. They wouldn't let them be published during his lifetime. It was really only after he died that the church began to see that his writings really did make sense, that they really did have relevance. What Desjardins did was to blend theology with his other studies, with archaeology and anthropology. By the way, he was on the expedition that discovered the Peking man early in the 20th century. And so he has a whole different take on God and the world, because he sees it from both the scientific and the theological point of view. He develops a whole vocabulary, which again, because of time, I can't necessarily go into. But this is one of his quotes. "Someday, after mastering the winds, the waves, the tides, and gravity, we shall harness for God the energies of love. And then, for the second time in the history of the world, man will have discovered fire." Desjardins is talking about the potential for love. And I always found it interesting. As soon as I heard the sermon of our presiding bishop, Michael Curry, at the wedding of Prince Harry and Meghan Markle, when he talked about the way of love, I thought of these words from Desjardins. They're basically saying the same thing. Love is an energy. And Desjardins, as a scientist, knew that there are only two things in reality. It's either energy or matter. And love is an energy, and it has great power for that reason. if we can harness it. So let's do the next slide. This one is talking about human suffering, and even human suffering is something that Desjardins sees as having at least potential energy. So human suffering, the sum total of suffering poured out at each moment over the whole earth, is like an immeasurable ocean. But what makes up this immensity? Is it blackness, emptiness, barren wastes? No, indeed. It is potential energy. Suffering holds hidden within it, in extreme intensity, the essential force of the world. One of the things that Teilhard talked about and believed in was that evolution continues with the human race, that humans evolve in their consciousness of greater reality, the purview of the mystics. And everything has the potential for helping us to advance in our consciousness, including suffering. This is some words that might help us to deal with suffering, either our own suffering or the suffering that's going on right now in our society, that it has potential energy, the potential energy to change things. And I think we're already seeing some of that change. I mean, the very fact that we are not able to meet face to face, but we're able to meet through the magic of technology is a sign that we're starting to learn ways of using our suffering to bring us into something new. So let's go further. And again, this is talking about the fact that God is continuing to create. And this is kind of a warning from Teilhard that God's work and the speed of God's work is not always as fast as we'd like it to be. Above all, trust in the slow work of God. We are quite naturally impatient in everything to reach the end without delay. We'd like to skip the intermediary stages. We are impatient of being on the way to something unknown, something new. And yet, it is the law of all progress that it is made by passing through some stages of instability, and that it may take a long time. I don't know whether that's comforting or not. The comforting part is that, ultimately, God is in charge. God will bring everything to fulfillment, but it's going to take a long time. This pandemic will end. It may take a while. Okay, let's go on. So, how do we become mystics? Now, I've got a section here about how that happens according to mystics, but in the interest of time, let me just go through it very quickly. St. Teresa of Avila, in her book, one of her books, talks about
The Interior Castle?
No, it's not that one.
Okay.
The Life of Perfection. I think that's the name of the book. Yes, The Life of Perfection. It's a book that she wrote actually for the nuns in her own convent to help them to become mystics. And she talks about 4 stages. So let me just go through them without saying too much about them. I won't read every single line. So the first stage is meditation, which is basically thinking about the scriptures, thinking about the life of Christ, and kind of using our minds, but letting our minds wander. Then there's the prayer of quiet, and this is the essential stage, because it is when we quiet our minds that we're able to arrive at the next stage. And then the the stage of union is when all of your faculties fall asleep and you become absorbed in being one with God. And this is where the soul actually becomes one with God. And finally, rapture, where all of your facilities fall away and are suspended. And the Lord gathers up your soul. These are her own words. It's a little bit complex. And again, if we had more time, I would spend more time now analyzing that. But can we go to the next page? I do want to talk for a little bit about a more modern version of the Stages of Mysticism. And it is by Richard Rohr. Many of you know Richard Rohr. He's a Franciscan priest who writes a lot about mysticism and mystics. He's also a psychologist. And he writes this really from a kind of psychological point of view. So his 4 stages, which have modern names, are cleaning up, growing up, waking up, and showing up. So cleaning up means overcoming our self-centeredness and learning to follow the rules. Now, these don't have any ages assigned to them necessarily, but that first one is typically in childhood and adolescence, when we learn what it means to be a good boy or girl, to be a good person. And we take the rules very seriously and very literally. Growing up means learning to understand the rules symbolically rather than literally. That the rules that we have, including the 10 Commandments, point to something beyond themselves, something much deeper. 3rd stage, waking up, is something that's usually triggered by some sort of death to the ego. We sometimes question our past life. We wake up one day and realize that things we've done in our lives have just been horrible, and we wish we hadn't done them. And what happens is that in the psychological terms of Carl Jung, we fall from the small self or the ego into the true self, the self as God made us, which contains our full potential. And this is the one that I really like because it's one that often doesn't show up in the writings of the mystics, but it shows up in the way they live their lives. It shows up in all their works. Showing up means returning to engagement in the with the world in the form of a servant. So how can we follow the mystical path? First of all, we don't have to wait for a mystical experience. We only need to establish a time each day to spend with God. God is always eager to come to us, always. We only need to have an open heart and let God in. Remember that the mystical path leads to a change of consciousness, but it begins with a change of heart. It's a matter of letting go to our attachment to all of the things that we hold dear to us in the world and learning to attach to God, who is the true source of our being. So once we experience God's love, grace, and peace, we need to make it the cornerstone of our lives. We need to establish a rule of life which supports our mystical journey. And again, these are topics that, I think Grace mentioned them last month. They deserve much fuller explanation, but our time is running short, as Pat Sajak would say. Having heard that much, I want to take a poll and ask everybody who is listening. Grace, can we have the poll? There you go. Have you ever experienced a direct encounter with God? Was it a spiritual experience, a spiritual and physical experience, or just simply a physical experience? Or if you're not had an encounter. So I'll give you a little bit of time to vote.
I got to say, this is where I really wish we could talk with people and hear about their experiences, because I'm already fascinated just watching the poll.
Well, guess what? We are going to. Wow.
That's
86%,
cool.
6 people had a spiritual and physical experience. So what I'd like to do is to invite you to, anybody who'd like, to share their experience in whatever amount of detail you want to give. And also, this is a time to ask questions. So if you'd like to speak, Grace, what's the best procedure?
Well, I think I'll leave that one to April. There's a way that we can promote people for a moment.
Absolutely. Just raise your hand or note in chat and we can allow you to speak.
While we're waiting, I'm really fascinated here by the fact that everyone reported a physical aspect to their experience. And I think that says so much about a mystical experience, that it isn't just this spiritual disembodied, it's a physical, there's often a physical aspect to it. And it is very much embodied and part of who we are and the world around us. So I find that those responses fascinating.
Yeah, yeah.
I'm going to close the poll. Hey, Tom.
This was 2005, Evergreen, Colorado, at a retreat. Sunday morning, I walked into the shower, and as the water began pouring over me, I was given a profound gift of tears, compunction.
Mm-hmm.
And I was going through a very challenging place in my life at that time. And I was given a vision. That time, nothing ever since, but life-changing.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you for sharing that. That's wonderful.
The vision, if in case you're interested, is I was about to be executed and put in front of a firing squad, and Jesus stepped in and took my. And for me, that was far more real than any other redemption story that.
Yes, really.
Yeah.
That's the thing about mysticism, is that it does make faith and religion very personal, and we understand it from a personal point of view. Yeah.
Yeah, indeed. So David wrote, in centering prayer and at other times when I stop to focus on the presence of God, I frequently feel a sense of great burden being lifted from me. Indeed.
Mm-hmm.
David, do you want to talk about that?
Well, I think I often do better writing things down first. And yeah, I certainly have that feeling quite often. And it's sometimes it's a great burden, and sometimes it's a small one.
Mm-hmm.
But that it and often a sense of direction. I'm working on the process of discernment. I'm trying to use the book titled Discernment, edited from the works of Henry Nouwen.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
A modern day mystic. Yep. Good.
Thank you.
Thank you, David. I want to read from chat the comment by Norma. After my father had died, I was very upset and crying. I felt a hand on my shoulder, but no one was in the room with me. But I experienced a sense of peace and loving touch. Oh, that's a wonderful experience. Thank you for sharing that, Norma.
I was really upset because I was afraid my dad had died alone and I wasn't there with him. And I was feeling very, very upset. And all of a sudden, I just felt this sense of peace in this arm or hand on my shoulder. But I was alone, so I wasn't alone. I found out I wasn't alone.
Yes, yeah. Well, you're not alone in that experience. It's more common than you might expect. But it's wonderful that you experienced it.
Yeah.
Yes.
Thank you.
Anybody else, or would anybody else have any other questions or comments? No? Going once, twice? So I want to end with what I feel are consoling words from some of the mystics. Because in a time of crisis, a time of chaos and confusion, we need everything we can get to keep us going. So Grace, there should be one more page there. So these are words of consolation from the mystics. The first one is from Julian of Norwich. I'm not sure if I mentioned her before or not. She was a woman who lived in England in the, my sense of time is just so off. I think it was the 13th century. That's right, it was the 13th century. Because the 14th. She lived in the 1300s. And she wrote, this is probably one of her best well-known sayings: all will be well, all will be well, all manner of things will be well. Now you have to realize that Julian of Norwich wrote that just after the Black Plague had swept through Europe, and a third of Europe was killed. And during her lifetime, it was actually just before she was born. She was a child of 5, I think. And then during her life, adulthood, it came back again. It was a second wave. And yet she was still able to write that. And this is one of my favorites from Teresa of Avila. Let nothing disturb you. Let nothing make you afraid. All things are passing. God alone never changes. Patience gains all things. If you have God, you will want for nothing. God alone suffices. And I think there's one more. And this is from Henry Nouwen. And I think David mentioned Henry Nouwen. He was a Roman Catholic priest from the Netherlands who came to the United States to teach, and he taught for 20 years at the University of Notre Dame, Yale, and Harvard before he went to Canada and became the chaplain at a home for mentally challenged adults. His writings have been a very important part of my life throughout my adulthood. And luckily enough, there's a society devoted to his writings, even though he is dead now, and they publish a blog, which is published every day. And this is one that showed up recently. I know how great a temptation it is in times of anguish and agony to look away from our painful center and expect peace and a sense of inner wholeness to come from some external source. But I am increasingly convinced that at times of anguish and agony, we have to choose a contained life where we can be in the presence of people who hold us safe and bring us in touch with the unconditional, effective love of God. Do not get involved in experiences of living that will lead to dissipation. What is so important is to have a deep sense of inner safety, of being held by a love that is in no way using you, manipulating you, or needing you. And so my departing words to you are that as we grow into the mystical life, as we take up the mystical path for ourselves, one of the things that we can do is to be those people who are signs of and bringers of God's love into the world. The world needs it desperately now. And so all the more reason for us to be in touch with our mystical selves, and if we're not already on it, to get on the mystical path. So thank you all for coming tonight and for your attention. At least I assume you were attentive. One of the difficulties of being on a webinar is that I can't see any of you.
Yes.
So I hope you got something out of this, and I hope I'll be able to talk to you again at some future date on another topic.
Well, and I wanted to thank you so much for being here tonight. I love this topic, and I love the possibilities, and I think it would be great to have further discussions on it as well. So thank you.
You're welcome.
And with that, I think we're done for the evening. Thank you all for being here, and I hope you have a wonderful night and a peaceful and restful night.